Tonight's presenters are the authors of this book. Pamela Ronald is professor of plant pathology at University of California, Davis, where she studies the role that genes play in a plant's response to its environment. Her laboratory has genetically engineered rice that is resistant to diseases and flooding, which are serious problems for rice crops in Asia and Africa. Her work has been published in the journals Science and Nature and featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and on CNN and National Public Radio. Roel Adamczak, a 20-year-old organic, a 20-year organic crop farmer and former instructor for California Certified Organic Farmers, has dedicated his career to the expansion and development of organic farming. He is the market garden coordinator at the UC Davis Certified Organic Student Farm. The market garden provides experiential learning opportunities to students interested in organic agriculture. I'd also like to take a moment to thank our many sponsors, so please bear with me as I go through all of them. The talk has been sponsored by the Department of Agronomy, the Bioethics Program, Wallace Chair for Sustainable Agriculture, Council on Sustainability, Department of Genetics, Development, and Cell Biology, Department of Plant Pathology, Center for Plant Responses to Environmental Stresses, Interdepartmental Genetics Program, Plant Sciences Institute, Molecular, Cellular, and Developmental Biology Program, Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Organismal Biology, and the Committee on Lectures, which is funded by GSB. The following student organizations are also sponsors: Student Organic Farm, Graduate Program in Sustainable Agriculture Student Association, Graduate Agronomy Club, Biochemistry, Biophysics, and Molecular Biology Undergraduate Club, and the Natural Resource Ecology and Management Graduate Student Organization. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.
I understand now why there are so many people here. If one person came from just each of those organizations, we'd have about this many people.
So thank you to all those sponsors. We're really honored to have so many sponsors of this event, and a great thank you to Anastasia. She's done a tremendous job in putting together this event and has been a great correspondent and blogger. So we are delighted to be here. You know, one of the two greatest agricultural universities in the world. So we're very pleased, and we have two small children, and we were able to come because my mother happily volunteered to babysit because she was a college student here and celebrated her 50-year reunion just a few years ago. So it's the right place at the right time for us. So I wanted to start out just by talking about why we wrote this book. So many people see organic farming and plant genetics as opposite ends of the agricultural spectrum. And sometimes they even think we don't speak to each other. But we do, and it's really not difficult because we have the same goal, which is a vision for an ecologically based sustainable agriculture. Still, many of our friends, families, and colleagues have asked us over the years, well, really, what is genetic engineering? What are genetically engineered crops? Are they safe to eat? Are they safe for the environment? And many of our colleagues and friends have also asked us, is organic agriculture enough to feed the world? So this book is really a response to those questions, and what we try to do in the book is bring the reader through the life of a plant geneticist and the life of an organic farmer to see what we really do and to distinguish between fact and fiction on the debate on crop genetic engineering. So the way we've structured this talk is Raul will speak for the first half and describe really what organic farmers do and the kinds of things that we've been thinking about in terms of global agriculture. And then I'll step in and finish up with some examples of agricultural biotechnology. So thank you.
We've given talks about this book in a number of places, such as San Francisco and the foothills of California, and also in Hawaii as well. And Iowa and Hawaii share a lot in terms of their experience with genetically engineered plants. And it's always a challenge to come and speak where people have a lot of knowledge and experience about agriculture and genetically engineered plants. But I feel it's important for us to come here and share our vision as to how organic agriculture and genetically engineered plants could work together, even though we may have a lot of experience here where there's a lot of conflict. And I start off, I can't walk away. One of the places where Pam and I start off together in agreement is looking at what kind of agriculture we have. And you're probably familiar with a lot of these problems. But we have an agricultural system here in the U.S. and in a lot of ways in the world in general that uses a lot of harmful pesticides that have an impact on the environment, on farmers, and farm workers. We have a system that uses a lot of soluble synthetic fertilizers that contaminate the environment, and we have a system that indirectly causes a lot of soil erosion, which degrades the agricultural land that we depend on. I'm going to go one of the other things about agriculture is not only does agriculture have some problems that have to be dealt with, but we're living in a world where there's malnutrition, and the population is predicted in just the next 40 years to increase by 3 billion people. And that is that's a huge burden, I think, for agriculturalists around the world to address these problems. On top of that, we have to deal with global warming. So it's going to cause problems around the world of increased sea levels, which may cause salinization of soils. There are going to be problems of weather extremes. So these issues are laid on top of these other important aspects of agriculture. California, in case you didn't know, it is a wonderful state because it keeps track of pesticide use. And this is a graph of pesticide use in California for the last 10 years. And what surprised me about this is that pesticide use in California hasn't gone down over the years. In California, there's been a lot of programs, IPM programs, that were aimed at reducing pesticide use. There's been a lot of education, but still we have a more or less constant level of pesticide use, despite the fact that there's less land in California that's being farmed, and one of the most pesticide-intensive crops, cotton, is acreage is reduced by a third to a half just because of the cotton market. So you'd expect that pesticide use would have declined, but indeed it has not. Although there has been an improvement in the in reducing the toxicity of pesticides that are being used. And the lower levels that you see there are mostly a function of weather. In drier years, we've had a drought for about the last 10 years. In drier years, fewer pesticides are used. And the impact of pesticides on the environment, as you know, it kills non-target species. It kills insects and birds and worms. And in California, we have about 1,000, more or less every year, pesticide injuries that are reported. So it's an ongoing and a constant problem. In the rest of the world, where there are also quite a few pesticides used, the World Health Organization estimates that there are 3 million cases of severe pesticide poisonings every year. This is a potato farmer in Ecuador, and he has some equipment on. He does have gloves and boots on, which is great. He left his respirator at home. The other issue that you probably have heard a lot about living in Iowa is synthetic fertilizers. This is a anhydrous ammonia applicator. And the impact of fertilizers is that the synthetic fertilizers that are used are very soluble, and the nitrogen and phosphorus that's not taken up by the plant is washed into waterways, washed down the Mississippi River, and in this case goes into the Gulf of Mexico, where it causes algal blooms. The plants die. They drop to the bottom of the Gulf there, are decomposed by microorganisms that take all the oxygen out of the air, and you get a eutrophic condition, essentially a dead sea. So here's a great photo of life and death right next to each other. But this is only one of This is only one of 200 sites in the U.S. where this level of eutrophication is a serious problem. Dead zero. In case you wondered, world nitrogen fertilizer use has continued unabated. The dip there was the fall of the Soviet Union, where agriculture went a little crazy. But since then, it's recovered. One of the other issues about nitrogen, of course, is that synthetic nitrogen is produced using natural gas, and it takes the equivalent of about 30 gallons of gasoline to make the nitrogen that is applied to an acre of Iowa farmland for corn. So it's not only is it polluting our waterways, but it's using a lot of energy, putting a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere. I was surprised. I wasn't surprised at the fertilizer increase over the years, but I was surprised at where it's being used mostly in the world. I thought North America would have been the center of nitrogen use around the world, but it turns out that China and India and other parts of Asia are clearly outpacing the rest of the world when it comes to nitrogen use. So of the three problems that I mentioned, this last problem, erosion, is a worldwide problem. And over the last 40 years, 30% of the world's arable land has become unproductive. And if you look at this slide, the red areas are the very degraded soil areas. So at a time when we need more land to farm and to grow crops, we have less, in part due to agricultural practices that lead to soil erosion. And this slide, which I've shown in other places, maybe you've seen, this is from northwest Iowa, a unplanted field after a big rainstorm, and a lot of soil gets displaced. And as a result of erosion in the U.S., it's estimated, and it depends on the year and when the rains come, that 2 to 4 billion tons of topsoil are lost in a year. So imagine what the world is going to be like for your kids, really, if we continue with these agricultural practices that we have now. There's going to be more environmental degradation due to pesticides and synthetic fertilizers. There's going to be more soil erosion. There's going to be more hunger in the world. There's going to be a lot more strife. And the challenge for us, the challenge for agriculturalists, is to come up with a solution to this. So Pam and I have a vision of sustainable agriculture, and we came up with some criteria that I think generally you would share. You might add a couple, you might take a couple off, but in general, these are some of the criteria that we think would solve the problems, or at least help solve the problems that exist in agriculture today. The first one, obviously, provide abundant, safe, and nutritious food. That's what we need. That's what the rest of the world needs. Reduce harmful environmental inputs, pesticides, synthetic fertilizers. We can't continue to farm and degrade our environment at the same time. Reduce energy use and greenhouse gas emissions. Global warming might really be the most serious problem that we face in our lifetime, and everything we can do to minimize the impact of agriculture is going to help us live longer and our children live longer. Practices that improve soil fertility, that keep the ground covered to reduce soil erosion are really critical to any sustainable ag program. It's enhance crop genetic diversity and protect biodiversity. A lot of these criteria influence each other. And if you want to have a system that has stability, it needs to be genetically diverse. It needs to incorporate a larger number of crops, which also helps the biodiversity in the environment that is adjacent to agriculture. Maintain the economic viability of farmers and rural communities. My years as a farmer, I always wanted to make a living, and I assume that all farmers want to make a living. And it seems like it's been a struggle here in the U.S. It's a struggle around the world. But the impact of the economics of farming is probably felt here in Iowa more strongly than in many places of the world. One of the aspects, it's another problem of agriculture that I didn't put up there, but the ability to recycle agriculture and urban green waste back into agriculture is also critical to make agriculture work. If all our wastes are ending up into waterways and contaminating the environment, it just doesn't make any sense at all. And of course, if you want to look at agriculture, you have to look at the world, and improving the lives of the poor and malnourished around the world is something that we do not only because we have humanitarian goals, but because if the world has less strife, then we have a better life as well. So, organic farming has a lot of practices and ideas that help achieve our sustainable agricultural goals. Organic agriculture came about in the first place as a response to the problems of conventional agriculture. And in the U.S., it has been the leader in developing alternatives and trying to ameliorate environmental problems. This is my farm last fall, and when I think of the farm and I think of other organic farms, I think the basis for it has been health. It's been health of the soil, health of the farmer, health of the food, health of the consumer. Those have been the main goals of organic agriculture. So there are several practices in organic agriculture that would be useful to include in a sustainable ag system. The first one is how organic agriculture controls pests. Overall, it's been documented that organic agriculture uses 97% fewer pesticides than conventional systems, and that's done using resistant varieties, using crop rotation, supporting the natural enemies of insects, and using some naturally occurring pesticides. Another key to the process is the alternatives that organic agriculture provides for improving soils. This is a picture of us making compost at the student farm, and the university generates a lot of manure, and we get to turn it, at least some of it, into compost. If we didn't do this manure, for years, it was sent to a landfill, and then recently they take it and they spread it on a random field that's not even farmed. They just spread it out and leave it there. So it's critical, I think, if you want to take responsibility for your wastes, to return them to agriculture, and that's what organic agriculture has managed to do. The other important fertility practice is the use of cover crops. This is a field that's not too far along. It's about a month in the ground of vetch and bell beans, and they are legumes that have a symbiotic relationship with the bacteria that allow them to fix about 150 pounds of nitrogen a year out of the air. And using this form of nitrogen and recycled nutrients from compost greatly reduces energy use. And also, these are less soluble forms of nitrogen. So when there's rain or irrigation, I've seen different studies, but it depends on the field and the soil and all kinds of things, but 40 to 64% less nutrients are leached out of the field. And finally, a key for any agricultural system is to have crop rotation. You can't tell from a static slide that we have crop rotation on the farm, but you can see the diversity we have, and we have a program to rotate our crops from place to place. So you might ask, after all that, well, is organic agriculture enough? Is it enough to feed an increasing population? Is it enough to deal with whatever is presented to us by global warming? And looking at it critically, which is not always easy for me to do, I can see that there are some pests and diseases and weeds and abiotic stresses that are very difficult to address using organic methods. Another issue is today there's about 3.5% of U.S. agriculture is organic, and there's 96.5% that is not, and there's not much in between, and it's difficult to change how people farm and help solve these problems. And we might be able to increase the number of organic farmers, but we're not going to, in the next 50 years, we're not going to change everybody. The other big question that that people ask is about yield. And, yield really depends on the crop and the place and the farmer. If you look at the studies that compare organic and conventional yield, you can find some crops where the yields are essentially the same, and you can find some crops where organic yields are significantly lower than conventional yields. And in a society where we have abundant food, the yield issue might not be such a big deal. We could afford maybe to have 15 or 20% lower yield. But in a world where the population is increasing and the stresses upon agriculture are greater, yield becomes much, much more important. The final thing about organic agriculture is it may be too expensive for low-income consumers. I'm not really a low-income consumer, but I often go to the store to buy food, and I don't buy a lot of produce, but I often pick up something like a watermelon, which I know what it takes to grow, and I know how much I enjoy it. And if it's an 89-cent a pound watermelon and it weighs 15 pounds, it's a $12 or $13 melon. It just seems, whoa, that's an expensive melon. Even I can be put off by the prices, but I have a memory of lower prices. Anyway, so the thing about yield is important, because if we want to grow food for more people, if we don't increase yield on the existing land we have to increase yield. We have to get yield off of new land. When I saw this photo, it took me quite a while to get the perspective here of what was going on. This is a hillside in Ecuador that is farmed. And as a farmer in the Sacramento Valley, it's inconceivable to me that you could farm this. It's remarkably steep. And if this is the kind of land that we need to bring into agriculture in order to feed people, we're in trouble, because it's not easy to farm this, and the environmental consequences of something going wrong on this are huge. So another part of agriculture is water. And as the population grows up, as the population increases, and as agriculture expands, more water is needed. Unfortunately, the amount of water available in the world, freshwater availability on a per capita basis of world population, has declined fourfold since 1950 and is not getting any better. And there are many people in the world who are already facing water shortages. And not surprisingly, agriculture uses 67% of the water in the world. So as populations increase and there's more of a demand on water, water is going to be taken from agriculture. That's what's happening in California. So there's less irrigated land available. There's lower yield. We're in a bind. Oh, and on top of that, despite this water use, 30 to 40% of total global yield is lost to pests and stress and other diseases, and even post-harvest pests. So it is important for us to get increased yields with less water and reduce crop losses as well. Because if we don't, what is already happening is that there are food riots around the world. Haiti, Bangladesh, and the UN is concerned that the stability of many parts of the world will be really jeopardized if there are ongoing continued food crises. So we get to a point where, at least Pam and I get to a point, because those are the skills we have, where we have to look at what the potential for genetic approaches are when it comes to improving crop production. And we have to start to understand when genetically engineered crops are the most appropriate technology for solving the problems we have. And Pam's going to talk about that.
And I want to say before I start, of course, we realize and acknowledge that you need to have stable governments, you need to have adequate government policies. There's a lot of issues that come into play when you're feeding the world and trying to reduce poverty. But really our talk is focused on plant breeding and farming because that's what we do. So just wanted to keep that in perspective. So to remind you that human beings have been domesticating crops for estimated 10 to 12,000 years. Modern wheat was derived from Turkey, rice from Yangtze, China, and corn from Mexico. So initially our ancestors were using simple types of selection, picking the best seed, but over time as genetics became more advanced, the genetic improvement started to change. So here in Iowa, you developed hybrid maize, which had a huge effect on yields. People started mixing different species together. So, for example, over 100 years ago, there was a cross between wheat and rye. Other types of laboratory techniques were introduced, such as protoplast fusion, which is taking two cells from very diverse genetic types and fusing them in the laboratory. We've seen X-ray mutation breeding, which uses chemicals or radiation to randomly create mutations in the genome. And interestingly, there really has not been any public outcry against these genetic manipulations until the first genetically engineered crop was approved in 1993. And so now we have, in 2005, farmers planted the billionth acre of genetically engineered crops, and here we are today talking about the usefulness of these techniques. And certainly many scientists see genetic engineering as simply the next natural step in crop breeding, and many others see genetic engineering as completely unnatural. So just to remind you, this is maybe a slide all of you have seen here in Iowa, but this is the progenitor of modern maize shown on the top, which is teosinte. To get at those kernels, you have to break it open with a hammer. There's about 10 seeds per head, and of course modern corn, with the help of many fantastic Iowa breeders, we have this very high yielding corn. So this corn is producing about 100-fold more food per acre of land. So this gets back to the idea of conserving our land and water resources by having very high yielding varieties. And then just to remind you, domestic or conventional breeding has introduced dramatic genetic changes. So this is actually a single species from Brassica, and this is breeding that's been carried out over the last 800 years in Europe, and we have very tasty broccoli and Brussels sprouts, but you can see these massive genetic transformations that have occurred through conventional breeding approaches. So I want to really briefly say, for those of you that are not geneticists, the difference between genetic engineering and another type of modern genetics called precision breeding, and how that differs from conventional breeding. So with genetic engineering and precision breeding, geneticists and breeders introduce only to one to few very well characterized genes are introduced at a time. And with genetic engineering, you can introduce genes from any species can be introduced. Precision breeding is a slightly different technique, and so it's limited within the same species. And that's shown diagrammatically here. So in conventional breeding, so these bars represent genomes, which geneticists love to do. So you have the yellow genome on the left and the red genome on the right. You cross them through pollination, and you end up with a mixture of genomes, essentially half and half of each of those genomes. And through a further process of breeding, you can try to narrow down the new variety carrying the trait that you like. But you always have other types of genes coming in from the parents, and they're usually not characterized. So with genetic engineering and precision breeding, you essentially take your variety that you like, you know it works, the farmers like it, tastes good, and you introduce a single gene. And so that's visually, I think, how you can think about this. So one of the first criteria, of course, is, are these crops safe to eat? Because you cannot have a sustainable food supply if you can't eat the food, if for some reason it's unsafe. And I just wanted to, we can talk about this during the question and answer, but I just really wanted to remind you that 2 billion acres of genetically engineered crops have been planted cumulatively around the world. There's not been a single case of adverse health or environmental impacts. And so really what that means is the genetically engineered crops that are now commercialized are safe to eat and safe for the environment. In addition, the National Academy of Sciences has written several reports indicating that the process of genetic engineering doesn't present any additional risks, so the risks are similar as the process of conventional breeding. So these are different ways of mixing genes together, but the processes themselves really present similar risks. So you always have a risk. Anytime you develop a new variety, there are going to be some risks. And it's not only the National Academy of Sciences in the United States, it's virtually all the expert scientists in all the lands that have looked at this. So, for example, the Royal Society in Britain has looked at this, has written 4 separate reports and come to these same conclusions. So, of course, that doesn't mean that all genetically engineered crops are going to be safe to eat or safe for the environment. And I think this is one of the sticking points, is it's not black and white. And really all new crops must be considered on a case-by-case basis. And this makes it really tiring for the consumer, right? Could you just give me the answer and then I can forget about it? Well, no, because it's really an ongoing process and everything has to be looked at individually. So now I want to just talk about, I'm just going to give 3 examples of genetically engineered crops and crops that have been bred through precision breeding that are now out and about. So first, this is a picture of a cotton bollworm emerging from his egg. And this is a very terrible pest. It's thought that 25% of the world's insecticides are used to control this pest. So geneticists really took a page out of the playbook from organic farmers on this one, and they decided to genetically engineer cotton with a protein that's an insecticide that's widely used by organic farmers. So organic farmers spray a formulation that has the entire bacteria carrying the protein. They dry it, they spray it on the crop, whereas geneticists now have engineered the single gene into the crop, and so it's expressed in the corn. And just to remind you, this concept of pesticides, some insecticides are really quite toxic. So, for example, of the 15 insecticides used in the United States on cotton, 7 are thought to be carcinogens or potential carcinogens. So anything we can do to reduce the amount of those insecticides is good for consumers and good for the environment. So I just want to run through this. BT cotton is probably the most widely planted genetically engineered crop, and there's now good data from around the world of the results of these of planting this. So in Arizona, BT cotton produces the same yield as conventional cotton with half the insecticides. And that's important because that translates immediately to increased biodiversity in the field. So BT cotton has more species of insects as measured by ants and beetles diversity as conventionally grown cotton. And of course that's not surprising because anytime you start spraying insecticides, you're not only killing the target pest, you're killing everything out there. In India, BT cotton has been widely embraced. This is a study of 375 farms in central and southern states in India over a period of 5 years, and farmers were seeing a 37% increase in yield, a 41% reduction in insecticide, and that translates to $135 per hectare profit gain. And especially in these countries where people are living really on the margin, these are dramatic gains for those people. So in China, in the first few years that BT cotton was introduced, the insecticide use fell by 156 million pounds per year. So just to give you an idea of how much insecticide that is, that's almost equivalent to what we spray in California, in the Central Valley every year. And California produces 50% of all the fruits and vegetables consumed in the United States. So this is a huge reduction in insecticides, and these reductions are very well documented in the scientific literature. And accompanying those reductions are health improvements for farm families. Researchers have documented fewer pesticide poisonings. So, does this solve, again, the problem? Well, one of the points we like to make in our book is, no, genetically engineered seed is very useful. It has very clear and dramatic impacts on reducing insecticides, but it's really not the end of the story. So after 7 years of reduced insecticide use in China, populations of other insects that were not controlled by BT increased so much that farmers started spraying other kinds of pesticides to control the other types of insects. And so this doesn't mean that BT cotton failed. It's still very effective against the target insect, but it does show that the seed alone is not enough. You really need an integrated management system. If you're just focused on one pest, you need to think about the other pests. And Raoul's talked about different ways, organic approaches to control those other pests, whether it's through genetic diversity, crop rotation, or spraying other types of biocontrol agents or less toxic insecticides. And then there's another concern with any type of insecticide that you use, whether it's genetically engineered or sprayed. We know from 50 years of experience that the higher amounts of insecticide that you spray, the more likely you are to cause resistance to that insecticide. And surprisingly to many scientists, after 10 years, there's been very, very few cases of insects becoming resistant to BT cotton, despite how widely it's been planted and embraced by farmers. And there is an expert in this area, Bruce Tabashnik, University of Arizona, and he has documented the emergence of 3 insects that are resistant to BT. And interestingly, these come from fields where there has not been an integrated cropping strategy. And so, again, the idea is if you want to prolong the life of a very useful seed, genetically engineered seed, you really need to integrate pest management practices. So the second story is papaya. This is papaya. It's infected with papaya ring spot virus. Plants get viral diseases as humans do. And this was it still is a very severe disease. In the 1950s, the entire crop on the island of Oahu in Hawaii was destroyed by this virus. And the farmers really had nothing they could do except move. And at that time, there was no conventional approach to control this disease. There was no organic approach to control that disease. And even today, there is no method to control this disease and using conventional approaches. So they moved their crops to another island, but then in 1992, the virus was discovered on that island, the island of Hawaii, in the Puna area. And by 1995, the production plummeted. So the farmers were in despair, the Californians were in despair because that's where we get all our papayas is from Hawaii. So here is the hero in the story. This is Dennis Gonzalez. He is a local Hawaiian, grew up in Hawaii, working as a laborer in the plantations there, and he developed an interest in science and agriculture. He was educated at Cornell, and this was early on when people were just starting to genetically engineer crops. He thought, well, let me see if I can solve this problem, because as many plant pathologists predicted, the virus was going to spread to the island of Hawaii. So he began working on this disease, and he was able to genetically engineer a papaya that was tolerant or resistant to this disease. And in the middle is his genetically engineered papaya, and on the side are the conventional papaya. And this is a field of natural inoculation. So you can see the dramatic impacts of the genetically engineered papaya. And what he did is he took a snippet of a mild strain of the virus and he engineered it directly into the papaya. And so this is somewhat similar to how we're vaccinated. So, for example, we no longer have much polio or smallpox in the world because of vaccinations, where we were vaccinated with a little bit of that dead virus in the case of humans. So this just shows you the results over time from 1992 to 2001. The top in the red is total papaya production in Hawaii, and in blue is the production in the Puna area of Hawaii. And you could see when the virus was introduced in 1992, there was this immediate dramatic drop in production. And after Dennis and his team introduced the genetically engineered papaya, they saw a rapid rebound in papaya production. And most people credit Dennis and his team with saving the papaya industry in Hawaii. Another point I want to make is that the BT cotton was developed primarily by Monsanto, seeds sold by Monsanto, but the genetically engineered papaya was funded by a $60,000 USDA grant, and the papaya was distributed free to farmers. So again, I think some people conflate genetic engineering with corporate agriculture. Certainly, the corporate seed companies are taking advantage of this technology, but it's not restricted. The benefits are not restricted to those companies. So I wanted to finish with work from my lab. I work on rice. It's a staple food for half the world's people. This is a family's breakfast in Mali, cooking their rice porridge. Most rice farmers work on very small plots. This is a family farming in Egypt. And here is a farmer farming his field in Indonesia. So if we can enhance yield of rice, we're going to have a dramatic impact on lives of many people, most of whom are much less fortunate in terms of wealth as we are. So one thing about rice, when you think about it, you think, it likes water. Well, it does like water, but if rice is completely submerged for more than 3 days, that is, the top is completely submerged, it will die. And virtually all rice varieties will die if they're completely submerged. And this is a really terrible problem because 25% of the world's rice is grown in flood-prone areas in South and Southeast Asia. And we already have tremendous flooding in these regions every year, and this is only predicted to get worse with global climate change. So this and I wanted to mention, there's about 2.2 billion rice consumers in this area. 75 million live on less than $1 a day. And it's estimated that in Bangladesh and India alone, just in those two countries, 4 million tons of rice, enough to feed 30 million people, is lost every year to floods. So there was a wild rice that was found to be highly tolerant to submergence, and it was very rare in the total population. There's something like 80,000 different kinds of seeds that are saved in seed banks, primarily in the Philippines. And there was one that was of great interest to breeders because it was tolerant to flooding. It could stay underwater for 17 days, so it's a huge, huge difference. So for the last 50 years, breeders have been trying to introduce this trait using conventional approaches and failed to produce lines that were acceptable to farmers. And there's reasons why this breeding failed. It's considered a quantitative trait locus, so it's not so easy to score or phenotype for geneticists in the audience. And the varieties that were developed had a lot of genes that came in from this wild, weedy type of rice, and they were rejected by farmers. So about 15 years ago now, a colleague of mine, David McKill, who was at UC Davis, and he's now back in the Philippines at the International Rice Research Institute, asked me if my lab would try to clone the gene encoding this trait. And his vision was, if we can get at the genetic basis for this trait, then we can develop new varieties that are tolerant of flooding. And I wanted to show you a time-lapse sequence. I should say that we were successful. About 5 years ago, we cloned this gene. David McKill's group in the Philippines carried out breeding using, I should say, we showed we had the right gene using genetic engineering in the lab. The plants were completely tolerant after 17 days of flooding. And then Dave McKill used the markers that we developed to carry out a precision breeding or marker-assisted approach to introduce this gene into varieties that were favored by farmers. So I'm just going to show you one of the first field tests that was carried out in 2007 in the Philippines. And this is a 4-month time-lapse sequence. And what you will see on the left is the new variety, Sub 1, carrying the new gene. On the right is the conventional variety. Now there's a flood. And there's about a 17-day submergence, and you could see how the Sub 1 gene allows the plant to recover from this flood. So this is essentially a single gene. And I like to emphasize that this is really the power of genetics, that you see these dramatic differences, essentially genetically identical varieties, only the difference of a single gene can make this huge effect on yield. And in this field trial, the yields were about 3-fold higher on the Sub 1 variety that we call Sub 1 for submergence tolerance. So Dave McKill and his team then introduced this gene into other locally adapted varieties in Bangladesh, India, and other varieties in the Philippines, and carried out 4 years of field tests in farmers' fields. And in farmers' fields, what they saw were 3 to 5-fold increases in yield. And in each of these years, there's been tremendous flooding in Bangladesh. And so I was fortunate last year to visit with the team to meet the farmer and their families and to ask them what they thought about this. So she's speaking the language of Orissa, so it's a dialect in eastern India, and we also visited India. So this is Bangladesh. We also went to India, and really the comment that was most remarkable to me was one of the women said, not only did we have enough food to feed our families this year, but we had extra rice that we could sell and have some money. And it's such a dramatically different situation in other parts of the world than we have here in the United States. And I'm absolutely sure that modern genetic approaches are going to benefit those in less developed countries. So I want to just finish by reminding you that in the last 15 years, we have had unbelievable advances in plant genetics. So in 2000, the Arabidopsis genome was completely sequenced. It's estimated that took 7 years, $70 million, and 500 people. So Arabidopsis, for those that don't know it, it's a model plant. You can't eat it, but it has a lot of interesting genes. It has a very small genome, so it was the first plant to be sequenced. Well, next year, using some modern technology, it's estimated the same project could be carried out in 2 to 3 minutes for $70. So this sort of just gives those of you that are not geneticists the concept of the magnitude of change that we have seen in such a short time. And now we have the complete genome of rice, the first crop plant to be sequenced, and this week we have the report of the corn genome sequence led by some of our favorite scientists here, Pat Schnabel and many of his colleagues here at Iowa and other collaborating laboratories around the U.S., the National Science Foundation project. So the question is, what are we going to do with this information? And my argument to you today is that we should use this information for the public good. We should use it to make our farms more productive, more ecologically sustainable, and I believe this is something that we can do and we should do. And we don't want to leave this incredible information by the wayside because of some perceived risks. And I just want to end here to say right now there are about 30 commercialized genetically engineered crops cultivated worldwide. Most of these are produced by very large companies, and they're mostly in developed countries. But this picture is changing dramatically. There's a new report that came out by the European Commission that in just 5 years there'll be over 120 new genetically engineered crops around the world. This includes important staples such as potato and rice, which are not presently released. And of great interest, I think, is that half of these will come from national technology providers in Asia and Latin America designed for domestic markets. So when you look at the chains, it's quite dramatic. Within 5 years, most of the genetically engineered crops are going to be developed by developing countries and benefiting developing countries. So just to conclude, we really think that there's a place for genetic techniques, genetic engineering, and precision breeding in a sustainable ecological system, and in fact that we need to use the most appropriate technology and the best farming practices to enhance the sustainability of our farms and to feed the growing population. And really, I would argue, without good science and without good farming, we will fail to feed this growing population. So thank you, and we're very happy to take questions.
Just like to let everyone know that tomorrow's table is coming out in paperback next month. You can find it on Amazon and local bookstores. And there's also some hardcover copies over there at the table, and the authors have graciously agreed to provide signatures for anyone who would like. Now, if anyone has any questions, we'll let people get out of here as they need. And if you could line up at the microphone in the back there, please, so that we can all hear your questions. I will.
Want me to turn it off?
Yeah.
I can do that. I'll just unplug it. I'll just unplug it. Thanks for the sound. What time is it? The issues associated with overuse of fertilizers and pesticides, and we don't want to say that all pesticides are bad, all herbicides are bad. We just I think we need to discriminate between what's useful and the minimum amount that we can use. And your point is well taken. There is a huge continuum in conventional practices where some farmers are doing all they can to reduce their inputs and have dramatically reduced their pollution of streams, and there's laws that have been passed that have prevented farmers from farming right up to the streams. And your point is good about malaria. There was such a fear about DDT that it was pulled off right away, and there has been an increase in cases of malaria. So it's really what we're talking about is the judicious incorporation of best practices, and that's going to be different in every place.
I would suggest to you that there's more pollution going on in the state of Iowa from municipal utilities and municipal sewage treatment plants than there is from all of agriculture.
You know, I think the estimate for nitrogen and phosphorus that are flowing into the Gulf of Mexico, forming that eutrophic area, the estimate is that 52% of that comes from agriculture. And, this is another problem in the Midwest is that there's a lot of groundwater that's contaminated with atrazine and other herbicides. And it's, the different ways of looking at the environment, but in California, in agricultural areas, there are a lot of nitrates in the water supply, and there are nitrates in the water in Iowa too. So I just think it's important to try and solve these problems.
I was wondering, other than crop rotation, what are some practices that you would recommend for the low-income Iowa farmer?
Well, you and we are very fortunate in that there's a researcher here in Iowa who has developed a crop rotation strategy that also incorporates the use of compost and legumes that he has shown to not only maintain yields but reduce synthetic nitrogen use by 74% and herbicide use by 80-something%. And it's a rotation of corn and soybeans and small grain and alfalfa. And I think most exciting of all to me was that he and his group of researchers have also shown that it was economically the most profitable system to grow as an alternative to just growing corn and soy. So the answers are there, the solutions are there. People just need to begin to adopt them more widely.
Hi, I'm Carlos Ariza. I'm actually from chemical and biological engineering, and I had a question on basically keeping, or if you could comment on keeping genetically modified organisms public good, because you said one of the things you hope is that this is for the benefit of the public, right? So, I just actually recently watched Food Inc., and I have this idea in my mind of how Monsanto genetically engineered an organism, corn specifically, and then that modification got, spread across other fields, and so now they have the right to, at least in the States, they own that gene, so they can essentially say that the farmer cannot, save his seeds because they're saying that those seeds are owned by Monsanto. So the farmer essentially doesn't have control over his seeds. So, and as more corporate involvement gets involved in universities, I was wondering what your comments are on trying to keep those seeds, for the public good, and produced at a university and made for farmers to use on a public basis.
So there's a couple of things to keep in mind. So first, genetic engineering did not develop at Monsanto. It developed in publicly funded laboratories, primarily in Belgium and Washington, and the companies did use this technology because it's quite useful. But really, it's Iowa breeders that created these problems because they created these fantastic hybrids, right? And so then the companies started to protect the inbred lines. I'm sure many of you know more about this than me. And so really, it's the hybrid that's produced. The seed, farmers don't self their seed. They buy the hybrid every year. Anytime you have a hybrid variety, farmers are going to buy the hybrid. And it's the same for organic farmers too, and Raul can talk more about that. If there's a nice hybrid seed available that's high yielding, they'll buy the seed. And many farmers don't self their own seed in the United States. I just want to make two more points. I know Raul wants to hop in there. Nevertheless, it's a critical issue of who owns the germplasm, who controls the germplasm. And over the last 10 years, we've seen a consolidation of the seed industry into the hands of a few large corporations in the United States. And I think that's something that people should be concerned with. But it's not genetic engineering, right? These are antitrust issues, and I think that is where the focus really should be, and actually the Obama administration is looking at that right now. And then in terms of public funding for research, I'm all for it. So for example, the Submergence Tolerant Rice was funded by the USDA and USAID for really almost 15 years, and I think we had a really good partnership with the group in the Philippines. And the one thing I didn't mention, these varieties have been released now in India and in the Philippines, and soon they'll be released in Bangladesh. And they're distributed through the normal channels of seed distribution, and the farmers can self their seed. And so I haven't seen the movie Food Incorporated, but I imagine that it may provide a very one-sided view, and I don't believe it's written by farmers or breeders or scientists.
I did get that from the movie that seemed to be the big problem was more law than genetic engineering.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah.
You know, at the same time, it may turn out that with Monsanto and Syngenta and Pioneer and DuPont controlling the germplasm for corn and soybeans, it may be very difficult to incorporate other beneficial traits into those crops by other companies that would do well in a sustainable ag system. So I think it will be ironic and unfortunate if advances are made to improve crops and they happen in the developing world rather than in the U.S. because the technology here is controlled by a few companies. And
Or the germplasm.
with the germplasm, and in part the technology, but mostly the germplasm, yeah. And there are going to be meetings to try and determine if there's too much monopoly control in the agricultural seed system. And it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, whether the industry will be broken up and be made a little more competitive, or if it will remain the same. But I think if we want to develop sustainable ag systems that use this improved technology, that the system certainly needs to be broken up and there have to be more players.
I'll go ahead and ask another question if that's okay. Nobody else is fine. So you talked about incorporating proteins, for example, the BT cotton, right? And I was just curious to know, like, what happens after that crop gets destroyed, or that protein, what happens to that protein, which is essentially, I didn't understand if it was essentially in the pesticide as well, but you were just making that protein be produced by the plant. And so is it, I guess I understand that there's less fertilizer use, so I guess that first of all, if you could answer.
Well, the BT, when it's sprayed as a powder, as a whole bacteria, it has the plus side in that it's fairly selective, and it's effective to on a small range of insects, but it breaks down in sunlight in about 24 hours. So the protein basically is gone from the field in a relatively short amount of time.
And then finally, are there any reports on, for example, so the papaya, the virus that was prevented, are there any viruses that are being mutated because of this and then becoming more resistant or anything like that because of genetic modifications?
No, the genetically engineered papaya is still a favorite of farmers in Hawaii. It's 90% of all papaya are genetically engineered, and there hasn't been yet another virus that has overcome that resistance.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I had a question. Increasing the crop diversity was mentioned, and I was wondering if introducing GMOs is sort of sacrificed in that. For instance, corn and soybeans now are obviously like Pioneer and Monsanto. That's what they genetically engineer. But if we were to diversify our major food crops and have, hundreds of different varieties, are we at the point technologically where we could still increase yields, or would it sort of be a sacrifice?
Well, there's a couple of issues there. One is that one of the things that genetically engineered traits can do is reduce yield loss. That's one of the more important things, whether it's loss from insect pests or from diseases or from some abiotic stress. I mean, that was the example that Pam showed with the submergence tolerant rice, was that yield loss was reduced there. And those are really critical traits.
That was a case of enhancing genetic diversity by bringing in a gene.
Yeah. And if you increase the crop diversity, like if you have a rotation with 4 or 5 crops instead of 2, it in a way it's reducing the overall production of corn and soybeans, but it's increasing the production of small grains or a forage crop as well. What it actually does is change the economic structure of the farming area, which makes it more diverse, which requires more people. So, I think it has social and economic as well as agronomic effects, and I think they're all positive, rather than just looking at it in terms of yield loss.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I was excited to hear about your work on flood-tolerant rice. I've heard that one of the other genes that's being investigated is drought-tolerant varieties, and I'm wondering if you could speak about those a little bit. I'm wondering especially where this work is being done and how likely it is that the result will be covered by proprietary patents.
So there's been a few reports of drought-tolerant maize that has been developed, one by Monsanto, which I'm absolutely sure is covered by proprietary patents, and but then there's several other countries that have developed drought-tolerant maize. It's not out yet, and I think in all cases they've been developed through genetic engineering rather than precision breeding, and maybe some of the maize geneticists here know a little bit more about the status, but I think it's not expected to be released for probably 3 or 4 years. But it's definitely on the way, and there's also salt-tolerant crops that have been developed, and many other types of disease-resistant crops that have been developed.
How close are plant breeders to enabling non-leguminous plants to fixate nitrogen?
Well, that's a great question. I just spoke with a friend, a colleague of mine who works on rhizobium, Giles Oldroyd. Some of you might know him, and I posed that same question to him, like, okay, in our lifetime, and he was actually quite positive. We know so much more about the genetic basis of nitrogen fixation now than we did even 5 years ago, and apparently many of the cereals, such as rice, have many of the key genes. And there are some bacteria that actually can form endophytic associations, which are not nodules, but they can form some associations with plants. So some of the leading biologists in that area do believe that it is possible. And I would say even 10 years ago, a little bit thought to be a pipe dream, but it's getting to be closer. And that would, of course, have a dramatic impact on the use of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers if we could genetically engineer rice or corn for the ability to fix its own nitrogen from the air.
I have another question too. What particular traits would be best to breed into plants for organic production? Do you have any favorites in mind, Raul?
In California, in sandy soils, nematodes are often a problem, and very likely to become a problem. And there are a number of nematode-resistant varieties that have been developed. If there were hundreds more, I'd be a lot happier. And it's a trait where the gene the genetic information about what provides that resistance is known, and a professor at the university jokingly said to me, "Oh, I'm working on tomato resistance, nematode resistance for tomatoes for processing tomatoes, and I could just throw in 20 heirloom tomatoes and see how it works." So if there was a company or a university professor or a nonprofit group who wanted to develop new varieties using genetically engineered traits for nematodes or symphylans or aphids or other insects, it would benefit organic agriculture a great deal. And kind of a funny aside is that submergence-tolerant rice would also be a benefit to organic growers. The biggest problem in rice in California is weed control. That's what knocks the yield back. And one of the strategies for controlling weeds in organic rice is deep water, because if you keep the field flooded, it also kills the weeds as well as the rice. But if you have a submergence-tolerant rice, you can keep that field flooded and really suppress the weeds, and it would definitely help to improve yields.
And my last question is, do you folks see a day when conventional and organic agriculture do away with their antagonistic relationship and form kind of an awkward marriage?
Well,
Is he suggesting we have an awkward marriage?
he speaks what he sees, I guess. There are a number of people working on the idea of developing a sustainable agriculture that incorporates practices and ideas from organic and from conventional and from genetic engineering as well. And it seems to me that has to be the long-term goal. And that doesn't mean that organic won't exist, because there are reasons one might continue to farm that way for local markets, and because it's an enjoyable way to farm, I think, if you're a farmer. But for the country as a whole, for the world as a whole, it seems like an integration of practices is really the way to go. And there are a lot of obstacles to achieving that, but I think we have to.
Yeah, and I think we may see that achieved first in China and India, that true integration, because there hasn't been as much of this polarization, and those countries too are developing their own sources of genes and technologies, and they're going to be, and most of them are publicly funded research programs, and the farmers are very poor and going to appreciate, I think, if enhanced seed is provided to them. And good farming practices.
Or they may make the same mistakes we made here.
Start fighting immediately?
No, monocrop and put a lot of inputs into the crop and contaminate the environment.
Well, they're already doing a lot of that.
They're already doing that. That's
But the farms there are smaller. That's another thing. They don't have these massive farms, at least yet. They mostly, like the average farm in India is 1 hectare, a couple acres. And I think that's the same in India. In Japan, it's been the same, although I heard recently they're thinking of consolidating a lot of their farms because some of the farming is so inefficient. The farmers are just not making any money and leaving the farms abandoned. So things are changing.
I'm Jared Wilson. I'm a senior in agronomy, and I grew up on a large grain farm here in Iowa. I guess my question is, since I've grown up in the age of GMOs, channeling agreements, stuff like that have become a way of life. I was reminded of it the other day as I was climbing a bin, and I actually saw where a few years ago I'd taken a paint marker and written non-GMO with a line. I'm wondering, do you see any public acceptance or more especially like in the European Union, of genetically engineered crops? Because, for the first 5 years, it was frankenfood. It was, the end of everything. Have you guys seen a change in that? And what do you think needs to be done in order to really help people get behind genetically engineered crops?
Well, that's a good question. I was just in Germany and Switzerland a couple weeks ago at a Science and Society meeting where people were talking about this, and it was open to the public, and it was a very interesting meeting. And the sense I got was that things will change very slowly over there, but apparently Europe is now opening up. There's been several reports that have validated again that at least the genetically engineered crops that are available now are safe to eat, and there's, I think, increased realization of the need for feeding themselves. So right now there's some awkward situations, like farmers are not allowed to grow genetically engineered corn, so they import it from Brazil. So the Europeans are essentially contributing to mowing down the rainforest so they can plant genetically engineered corn there, so they can import it into Europe to feed their pigs and grow up their pigs in maybe what they're thinking of as a sustainable manner. But it doesn't really always make sense, and I think people are beginning to realize that Europe is not self-sufficient. And the issue in Europe, of course, is that it doesn't really matter how efficiently they farm because, like many of us, they have so much money. But I think it is starting to change with greater global awareness and education.
I don't think it's going to change until when you reach that point, then it's easy.
And another point that I had thought would make a huge difference, but I'm less sure now, is so genetically engineered rice that has enhanced carotenoid content is expected to be released in a couple years. So for those of you that don't know, this is golden rice, which was developed through support of the Rockefeller Foundation, completely nonprofit funded, to address this problem of vitamin A deficiency. So something like 500,000 children die every year because they're not getting enough vitamin A. And there's a lot of programs that have been carried out, supplementation programs, fortification programs, education programs to diversify the diet. But still, we're losing 500,000 children a year, and many, many more go blind. So this has been a really incredible project to develop this high carotenoid rice. And the estimates now, there's been several different reports that are trying to estimate what the impact will be when this rice is released. And the estimates range from saving the lives of 2,000 to 40,000 children every year. And so I thought, okay, well, when genetically engineered rice is released and you're seeing children's lives being saved, that's going to change everything. But, now I'm not so sure. In the United States and Europe, we're so far from understanding how malnutrition can kill children. I think we're so far away that many people just don't believe it. And as you may know, Greenpeace is fighting against release of genetically engineered rice. And so I think we still have a long way to go. I think that in Europe and the United States, people have to see how it affects them personally and their families personally. So it's a little bit harsh, but I think it's what we've seen so far.
Hi. You had mentioned how the sub-1 trait in rice increased yield, and then you also mentioned how it was kind of difficult or impossible to get through traditional breeding methods, and then the flooding of the fields would keep the weeds down. But if there was a gene that increased yield that was accessible to plants through traditional breeding methods, and it got into a weed, could you foresee any way of dealing with that, or is it just kind of something to be dealt with when the time comes?
So you're thinking, for example, if this emergence tolerance trait gets into weeds in the area, and now they're surviving the flooding as well. Again, it really depends on the place. So, for example, in California, there's been resistance to developing herbicide-tolerant rice because, and in the South, of the United States because there's a weedy rice that they're worried that there'd be pollen flow and that the weedy rice now would have this herbicide tolerant trait, and you're not getting very far ahead. In most cases, though, there's less concern for that. So most systems are highly domesticated, and the weeds that they see, so for example, the weeds in India and Bangladesh are not rice, so there's not that fear of cross-pollination. And actually those concerns of, what's going to happen to the native populations are very important, but they're also equally critical for varieties that have been developed through conventional breeding. So there is very little difference, if any difference at all, between pollen flow from a conventionally bred field versus genetically engineered field. So as you know, even in conventional breeding, breeders have brought in all these fantastic traits like resistance to bacteria, resistance to viruses, to nematodes, and so those traits have already been brought in. And so far as I know, there has not yet been a case where there's been pollen flow from a farmer's field into wild populations that have created problems in the wild populations. But certainly it's something that needs to be thought about, and I think greater awareness has been brought to that because of the concern about transgenes.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, sorry, I have another question.
Okay.
I was wondering, you were talking about rice and the helpful benefits that they put in for the children, but I know there's a concern with corn in the Midwest and the quality versus quantity argument, how higher yields actually, there's less nutrients in the different kinds as it's over the years. So I was wondering what genetics are doing to help with that.
So the plant breeders have chosen to have higher starch in the corn to increase the yield rather than to have higher protein. They could have chosen to select for higher protein rather than starch. So those are breeders' choices. And if corn breeders wanted to have a higher protein, higher lysine, higher whatever nutrient you want, breeders can do that. The choice that was made by Monsanto and Syngenta was to maximize other traits. So whatever we want, we can do, but it has to. There has to be demand for it.
I think most of the breeding in the United States up to maybe 15, 20 years ago was carried out in the public domain. There are a lot of different breeding programs, but many universities have now stopped their breeding programs and moved that breeding to companies, and so that does change the kind of seed that's being developed.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. How we exhausted them.
If there are no other questions, then I'd like to invite you to go over and take some bars and cookies and hot cider on your way out. And please join me in thanking our speakers tonight.
If you've been having trouble sleeping, we have our book for sale, and we'd be happy to sign it with some appropriate message about agriculture and sleep.